Suzanne Marion. I'm co-president with Dr. Roy Wiley and Susan Fishman. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our program today. We're so grateful to Elissa Guralnick coming in from Colorado. We're looking forward to her talk very much, and we appreciate Debbie and Gayle for putting it all together for us once again. So here we go. Welcome.
I'm Gayle Martin, and it is my extreme pleasure to introduce Elissa Guralnick. I first met Elissa in New York City when she was studying the piano as a very serious amateur, playing works by Liszt and Chopin and kind of the romantics. But now as a continuing as a very serious amateur pianist, she's recorded the Goldberg variations of Bach and is studying Prokofiev and branching out in that direction. But that is her life for fun. What she did for many, many years, she was a professor of English at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And she, after teaching English literature for many years, she switched to the music department and became a professor of English at the music department at the University of Colorado, Boulder. And so it has been a dream of mine to have somebody talk about music and literature for our club. So Elissa is the perfect choice, and I am just proud to introduce you to Elissa Guralnick, who is speaking to us from Boulder, Colorado.
Thank you, Gayle. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Can you all hear me? Yes. A pleasure to be here. I'm glad to have been invited, and I hope that you'll find this talk a little energizing. What I mean to do is to give you the opportunity to think about literature and music, probably in new ways. I hope that these will be new ways. Now, if I say literature and music to you, I think probably what will come first to your mind would be opera and song. In these two genres, music takes the lead. You think of opera, you think of the melodies in the opera, you think of the music, you think of the overtures. And in song, you are also going to think of the melodies. Fine, music predominates. Now, there is a connection between literature and writing, literature and music, in which writing predominates. And that will be in fiction, usually, fiction in which we talk about, the writer talks about music. A relatively recent novel that has a lot to do with music is The Time of Our Singing by Richard Towers. And you remember perhaps when that came out, it's actually about race in the United States and race in music. There were two brothers, half white, half black, and one becomes a singer, one becomes a pianist, and their story is told. So telling stories about people who are musicians, telling stories about people who are composers, these are ways in which literature addresses music. So there's lots of literature that is about music. I won't be talking about that much today. Also, I want to bring to your mind that in musicology, a lot is written about what else, about composers, music. And so you're going to get biographies of composers, you're going to get analyses of musical instruments and of instrumental music, and you're going to get analysis of song. So I would call to your attention or ask you to think about the possibility that when an article or a book is written in which the writing is every bit as beautiful as the writing of fiction, the writing of stories, that you might say to yourself, perhaps this piece of writing about music deserves to be called literature in its own right. I have one recommendation for you. It's ethnomusicology, which is usually a discussion of music, world music, but sometimes it's American music. And there's a new book by W. Chase Peeler. It's called On the Porch, and it's about music in Texas. Apparently, there is a place where music is done on a porch in a small town. And musicians come from all over Austin and so forth to play there. And he has written an absolutely beautiful book about being there, about the nature of the community. And it really is in itself a work of art. So if I say to you, well, there's literature about music, and well, there's music in which words play a part, what else is there to say about literature and music? I'm going to try to raise some other issues for you today. I want you to think about three possibilities or three issues in the relationship between literature and music. One is whether one of these art forms is superior to the other. That might seem like a very strange question. You're telling me that painting might be superior to music, might be superior to writing. It makes no sense, but I will tell you that composers and writers often worry about this issue. They really care about which form is superior. And as you'll see in a minute, that's because there is so much admiration for music that people tend to worry that music is better than all the other art forms. So you might take that into account in your club. Now, that raises the issue if you adore music, as I do. And after all, I'm an English professor. Poetry, fiction, this is what I do, so to speak. This is what I analyze. The question arises whether words can make music. And there are many writers who think about that and who work to make words make music. So that's a kind of joining of literature and music that you may not have thought much about. The other side of the coin is, can music speak? Can music tell a story? Can music have semantic value, or is it just, so to speak, music? Composers worry about that too. And so I'm going to try to introduce you to some of the issues at play when writers think about music and try to write musically, and when composers think about writing and try to draw writing into their work. So, music and words, which is superior? Well, you would expect musicians to be the ones who would say, it's music that's at the fore. They would champion music. And there is a poem by Robert Browning, Victorian poet, 19th century British poet, who speaks in a dramatic monologue in the voice of Opt Vogler, an organist. Vogler was, in fact, an organist in the 19th century. I'm just getting up my notes. Eminent in his day. So eminent that he actually competed informally with Beethoven in a competition at a party to see who could extemporize better. And, well, there are some who say that Opt Vogler won the competition. His full name was Georg Joseph Vogler, and Opt means abbé. He took religious orders in the same way that Liszt did. And so he, at any rate, was the great organist, and Robert Browning made him speak. And in particular, he spoke by comparing painting and storytelling to the activity of extemporizing in music. And this is what he says about music when he, the great musician, is extemporizing. Here is the finger of God, a flash of the will that can. He says that storytelling, painting, these arts cannot have that power. And so he says, sorrow is hard to bear and doubt is slow to clear. Each sufferer has his say, his scheme of weal and woe. But God has a few of us whom he whispers in the ear. The rest may reason and welcome. 'Tis we musicians who know. So those of you, you're all, I suppose, musicians who, when you're playing your instruments, consider that according to Abt Vogler, and perhaps through him, Robert Browning, perhaps not, it's musicians who know the will of God. Well, you say, of course, a musician would say this, and maybe Robert Browning had Vogler speaking for his art without Browning necessarily agreeing. Well, here's an eminent writer from the 19th century championing music. This is Walter Pater. He was an English writer and philosopher, the last half of the 19th century. He taught modern German philosophy at Oxford, and his great work, which people still read, is The Renaissance, Studies in Art and Poetry. And what he says about art, all art, in one of his essays in the Renaissance is, all art constantly aspires toward the condition of music. That certainly puts music at the top, the jewel in the crown of all the arts. What does he mean when he says all art constantly aspires toward the condition of music? Well, he goes on to say that art tries to obliterate the distinction between matter and form. And he says that only music succeeds in doing so. So music, unlike painting, unlike writing, cannot tell a story. It doesn't have semantic value. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Music is about itself only. You may remember the wonderful Leonard Bernstein lectures. Years ago, when I was a kid, you were kids perhaps, or even younger, in which he talked about whether music could tell a story and came down on the side of the answer, no. You can never be sure what story music is telling. You know what a painting is showing, you know what the story is, you know what a story is telling you, you know what the story is, but not music. And for that reason, according to Pater, music was the greatest of all the arts. Now, if music is superior to words, then it's no wonder that there are writers who can be caught in the act, if you like, of trying to make words become music. They at least want words to aspire to be music. And I'll call to your attention some stories, some novels that try this. One, and they try this in terms of literary experimentation. Let me experiment with language and see what I can do with it. So Richard Powers, again, in The Time of Our Singing, evokes many different styles of music in words. When he's talking about a classical artist, classical pianist, he may give you a long line in his sentences, and you can almost see that what he's trying to do is to give you the long line that you get in music. Sometimes Mahler, my trainer, when she wants me to be smooth in lifting the weights, in putting them down and picking them up, she'll say, give me a long line like Mahler. You can see that she used to be a singer. Richard Powers will give you a staccato prose when he's talking about singing or instrumental music that is staccato, that is rhythmic, that has a kind of march-like quality to it, perhaps. So you can follow that sometimes, and I would say be alert to it. When you're reading prose about music, ask yourself if the prose is trying to be like the music it's describing. There's a great story by Eudora Welty called Powerhouse, in which she follows some jazz musicians in their tour. And she takes one stop on their tour of the country, and they play music for the folks who are gathered round. And in Powerhouse, Eudora Welty, I'm reaching for my book to give you an example. Eudora Welty actually tries to give you the feel for jazz in her very writing. It's very hard to read this well, and I won't pretend that I can, but she says, just a little passage, late at night, the band, plays the one waltz they will ever consent to play by request, pagan love song. Powerhouse's head rolls and sinks like a weight between his waving shoulders. He groans and his fingers drag into the keys heavily, holding on to the notes, retreating. It is a sad song. You can watch her beginning to create a sort of musical sound. And now, you know what happened to me, says Powerhouse, not in words, in his music. Valentine hums a response, dreaming at the bass. So it's the bass that's speaking back to him. I got a telegram, my wife is dead, says Powerhouse with wandering fingers. Uh-huh. His mouth gathers and forms a barbarous O, while his fingers walk up straight, unwillingly, 3 octaves. Gypsy? Why, how come her to die? Didn't you just phone her up in the night, last night, long distance? Telegram here. Says the words, your wife is dead. He puts 4-4 over the 3-4. Hear the words, 3, your wife is dead. 4-4, your wife is dead. That's how she's trying to make that prose jazzy. You may or may not think she succeeds, but it's a literary experiment, and that's what she's trying to do. Samuel Beckett, another experimenter in literature. He has 2 radio plays, one called Words and, he's more than that, but the 2 I'm interested in, one called Words and Music, one called Cascando. And what does he do in these radio plays? He casts music as a character. He didn't write music. So he had to have composers create music for these radio plays. A variety of different composers did it, in which they talk to words. So Bob speaks as a character in words and Joe speaks as music. Well, make of it what you will. It may cause you to wonder, what actually is music saying here? Well, what Beckett is worried about is not what music is saying. He's worried about what words are saying. And can the words become musical enough that they can be in dialogue with music as music? Very difficult stuff. Fun, if you like it. Now I'll give you something which is the far end of making words make music. It's a piece by John Cage. We all know about John Cage, the 5 minutes in which a pianist sits on stage, just sits there, never plays a thing on the piano. This is the opposite in its way. It's a lot of noise. In Roratorio, Cage has made up his mind that what he wants to do is make music out of words, and he will do so by extracting words from the story that they're telling. What? He takes Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce as experimental piece of literature as you can find, and go ahead if you want to try and read it and find a story in it. It's rough work. But he's not going to read Finnegan's Wake. He's going to do a chance operation on Finnegan's Wake. He's going to take words according to a specific way of proceeding that he's using. And he's going to take them out of the middle of each page. And then he's going to have those words spoken. Now, those words are going to be spoken against a pattern of noise taken at different hours of the day. Actually, I think it's at 1 hour of the day, noon, in Japan, in Hungary, in the United States, in South America, on and on it goes. And he's going to put all this together, and he's going to call it a piece of music, Roratorio. If you can listen to Roratorio, you can probably find it online and hear anything but noise. I'm proud of you. I hear only noise. He calls it a kind of opera. Well, if you wish. These are experiments in making words make music. And I would say to you that they go from very lovely experiments with Powers and Welty through to chaos in Cage, but what would we expect from him? Now, all of that said, there are words that make music naturally by their very nature. And those, or literature that does so, that literature is poetry. Poetry really relies on the nature of words to sing. Poems sing. Now, I'll back away from poems just a little bit in order to ask you to think of oratory, and in particular, the orations, the speeches of Martin Luther King. If he isn't singing when he makes those speeches, whoever sings, his voice rises and falls. The sentences are long or short as he wishes them to be. Everything is chosen and everything is to some extent sung, and that's prose. That's not even poetry. Shakespeare gives us poetry, and there are some people who say that his soliloquies are operatic. You might as well sing. This is Tosca. Oh, well, it's Hamlet, but it's the same idea of a big set piece which is sung to an audience. But let's just think about poetry now as we narrow down to a much smaller form and consider that poets often talk about their work, their poems, as songs. Ballads, which are spoken, are songs. And when they're set to music as ballads, they really are songs. So consider song a metaphor for poetry, and consider words as having characteristics of music. Words have rhythm, and poetry really concentrates on the rhythm of a line. Words have syllables, and so you have a number of syllables in a line or a number of stresses in a line. That's very much like talking about the number of bars in a musical phrase. And so you're going to watch poetry imitate music. If I said to you that in addition to lines of poetry having a length, what about the length of particular words? I'm going to give you 3 words start with W, and I'm going to ask you to consider their length. Warmth, way, wit. Warmth. It's long. They're all one syllable, but it's long. It's spacious. You can't say it quickly. Way. That long A draws it out a little. Not as long as warmth. Way. A little long. Wit. Very short. Wit. What if I take wit and I add just one letter, an H? Wit, with, with. It lengthens. And so a great poet is going to take these characteristics of words and is going to play with them in such a way as to make the poem sing, if you like. There's a wonderful poem by John Crowe Ransom, and it's about the death of a little girl. It's the death of the daughter of the man who lives next door to him. And it's called Bells for John Whiteside's Daughter. And he begins by presenting to us, not discussing, actually presenting to us the little girl. And the lines are, there was such speed in her little body and such lightness in her footfall. That's an example, I think, of words making music. Speed is a long word. There was such speed in her little body. There it goes. In her little body, she moves along as if a musical line moved quickly. And such lightness in her footfall, in her footfall. Again, it's light. These are ways I would propose to you in which writers try to make words sing. And as a professor of literature, I think they succeed. And now I have a question for you. If it's the case that the greater the poet, the more musical the poem, even prose, the more musical the prose. If that's the case, then what are composers doing when they take a great poem with all of its music in its lines and make it a song? What are they doing when they take a poem and turn it into a song? Well, there were some poets, Yeats is a primary one, who thought, you know what they're doing? They're ruining it. That's what they're doing, ruining the poem. Yeats maintained that only lyrics should be set to music, a lyric in his mind being words made to be set to music. Now, if you think about the relationship between Ira Gershwin and George Gershwin, there you have it. Ira writing lyrics for George to set to music. And sometimes I think it may have gone the other way. I think I have this anecdote right, that one day Ira said to George, listen to this. And he plays something at the piano and George says to him, oh, that's a song, fascinating rhythm. So you watch those two working together to create songs, which are lyrics and music. But a poem and music, when you're setting Emily Dickinson to music, when you're setting Thomas Hardy to music, when you're setting Shakespeare is set to music. My goodness, even Virginia Woolf's prose has been set to music by Dominic Argento. What are you doing? Well, ruining the prose or the poetry, or translating music into translating words rather into the language of music. And when composers write songs, I think you could say that perhaps what they are doing is trying to translate something that they have read, spoken, heard by reading it out loud, trying to translate those words into their own language, which is the language of music. They want to say in a song what the poet has said in the poem. And they have to find musical analogs for what the poem is doing. They have to know or decide upon the tone of the poem. Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it sweet or is it bitter? Is it relaxed or is it anxious? And these, you realize, are decisions that the composer is making. I may read a poem and think it's sad. You may read a poem and think of it as moving toward the light, moving toward a kind of happiness. Someone else may see a kind of bitterness in it. So if this is the case, then when the poet, rather the composer, reads the poem and decides upon tone, he's not only translating the poem, he's analyzing it. He's saying, this is what it means to me. He has to know its pace. How fast would this be spoken? As in, there was such speed in her little body, or how light would it be? Such lightness in her footfall. He has to decide, I'm saying he, I should say they, I suppose, but I'm going to keep with the male pronoun. He has to decide upon its dynamics. Where does it pause? Where is it silent? Is it ever silent? He has to decide upon its shape. If it has several stanzas, is each stanza the same? So you're going to use, Schubert does this a lot. Schubert will give you the same music for each stanza in the poem, and yet he'll make small changes in the music, small changes in the melody, small changes in the harmony, or no changes at all, depending on what he feels like doing, in order to put the poem across. So the composer translates the poem into music. But the translation, to call a song a translation of a poem, is a little off, not quite accurate, because when you read a translation into another language, German, Russian, whatever, of a poem, of a story, of a novel, of whatever, When you read a translation, the only thing in front of you are the translated words. You don't have, unless you have facing pages, as you sometimes do in poetry, you don't have both languages, even if you have them both in front of you. You read one, then you read the other. You're constantly consulting up and back. But in a song, the two are together. The song is sung. The melodies, the harmonies, the rhythms, everything is accompanied by the words. And so when I talk about a translation, it's not quite as close to a translation as it could be. The music is relying upon the words in order for the music to tell the story it wants to tell. So in this respect, what we are seeing is the one inadequacy, if you like, of music, the one way in which it is not superior to poetry and to painting. It cannot tell a story on its own. One little exception. When you have an opera, let's take Wagner, he's the big example. When Wagner gives you an opera, he associates music with particular people. There are motifs which keep coming back and coming back and coming back. And once a motif has been associated with a particular character, with a particular action, every time it comes back by itself, it signals that character, that event to you. And the same thing happens in a song. When there is an interlude in a song, when there is a coda in a song, you have a right to ask yourself, what is that music saying? What is it saying? Schumann gives you codas. And I have worked a lot on the song cycle, Frauenliebe und Leben, A Woman's Life and Love. And what is very interesting about some of Schumann's codas, little pieces of music that come after the soprano gets finished singing her song, her poem. Sometimes that music is entirely different from what the soprano has been singing. Really, it's a mezzo. What is Schumann saying in that music? What is that music saying? We can often come to conclusions about that music. Sometimes Schumann actually takes a piece of music from later or from earlier in the cycle and puts it at the end of a song in the middle. And if you know the piece from the early part and the piece at the end, you might say to you, Schumann is trying to tell us here that while the singer is enthusiastic about the forthcoming marriage, the piano is worried. Will this work the way I hope it will work? Will this marriage be a success? It's a very interesting moment in which you actually can see music speaking. So I would say to you that when music is associated with words, and when it then speaks on its own without the singer, it can say what the words say, or what the words have said, if you know the words. Program music can't tell a story. Melodies from songs can tell a story if you have heard the words and remember them. So I'm going to give you a little test, so to speak, today, or a little bit of homework as you head to the rest of the program, where you will be hearing piano music and organ music, or music played on the piano and music played on the organ. You'll be hearing Ondine by Debussy. Do you know that Ondine is a water sprite? If you didn't know before I told you that Ondine is a water sprite, would you know it from the music? Would you hear a water sprite in that music, or might you hear something else? If I then said to you, what's that water sprite doing? What's it doing now? What's it doing later? What's it doing later in the music? What's it doing at the end of the music? You might have a very clear image in your mind, or you might say, in truth, I don't know. And those responses are responses in which you try to bring literature and music together and in which they move apart. They cooperate or they don't cooperate. You'll also be hearing Spring Night, which is a transcription of a song by Schumann. Would you know that that song, that music is transmitting to you a spring night, if you didn't know what the German title of the music meant? Would you know if you didn't have the title? Would you know it was a spring night? Does it matter if you know that it's Ondine on the one hand and a spring night on the other? Does it matter? Does music have its integrity irrespective of what it means in terms of the meaning of words and the meaning of stories? If you think that it does have its integrity, if you think even I am bothered by the words, I wish I didn't have the words, then you're probably agreeing with Walter Pater, who is saying that all art constantly aspires to the condition of music. Take in the art. Never mind the story that I'm telling you. Never mind the plot is really what we're saying if we're thinking about stories or poems. Never mind the plot. Do you get the music? Do you get the feeling? Do you get the emotional force of this? And the same thing will happen on the organ. Nessun Dorme, which is one of the pieces that will be played on the organ, is from Puccini. Do you know the opera Turandot? Do you know it? Do you need to know it in order to appreciate that piece of music on the organ? And you will also hear The Last Rose of Summer, which is a song based on the words are married to a traditional Irish tune. If you don't know the words to that song, in other words, if you're not Irish and you haven't been hearing that song sung since you were a tiny tot, if you don't know those words, does it matter? So I leave you with these questions, and I hope that what I have been able to do is to give you a sense of how words and music cooperate and where they separate, where the twain can never meet. And I hope that you'll have an opportunity as you listen to songs, popular songs, any kind of songs in the future, to think about the ways in which the music and the words are joining and the ways in which they are separating, unable to join. So I have brought to you today my two passions. Since I was a child, I've loved reading, I've loved music and making music, and I've spent my whole life sort of going up and back between them. I wish I could play the piano and the organ the way your musicians will do them soon. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope I brought you some new things to think about.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful. I have allowed people to unmute themselves at this point. If you have a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself, or a comment. Go ahead and do that. And then after you speak, if you don't mind, mute yourself again.
Who was the poet who the lines you quoted about the speed in her little body or the lightness of her footfall?
That's John Crow Ransom. And the poem is Bells for John Whiteside's Daughter. Ransom is spelled R-A-N-S-O-M, as if you were ransoming somebody. Right. And Crow is with an E on the end. John Crow Ransom.
Thank you.
Oh, of course.
I have another sort of comment, if you'd like to.
Please.
Sort of an addition. It was a great honor. I played Winterreise with John Vickers, and I'm sort of 75% of the it doesn't matter at school. For,
What the singer is singing?
no, for program music particularly.
Okay,
I think the music really speaks for itself, and it doesn't matter whether you think of the story or not. But for poetry, and also when I accompany songs, I don't really, I want to know the translation, but I don't think it has that much meaning as the music itself that I'm playing. But John Vickers, to prepare for Winterreise, he had a German coach, a professor of old German poetry, and he spent several sessions with her. Because it's, first of all, it's difficult poetry. It's not very good German. It's not modern German. But he was very intent on getting as much meaning as he could out of the poem. And then he would explain things to me, not the poetry itself, but he would take time explaining the emotion that he wanted to convey.
right.
And therefore he wanted me to convey too. So great singers do really prepare poetry.
They really do care. And if you would like to look up, it's a very short poem and performance on YouTube. There's a poem by Emily Dickinson, Heart, We Will Forget Him. It goes like this: Heart, we will forget him, you and I, tonight. You will forget the warmth he gave. I will forget the light. When you are done, pray tell me, and I shall straight begin. Haste, lest while you're lagging, I may remember him. Now, I've read this kind of upbeat. I've done that on purpose. Aaron Copland said that poem, and he said that poem in a sad tone. It drags. And when the singer says haste, she has a big jump in her voice, and it's set on two tones. It's melisma, and it's a huge space in her voice from a low note to a high note. And no way can you hurry singing that. And you may think to yourself when you first hear that song, what's going on? There's no match between the word and the setting of it. And I think in this case, what Copland is saying is, yeah, she says she wants to forget him. She does not want to forget him. You will forget the warmth he gave, the warmth. Why are you mentioning it if you want to forget it? And so it can matter enormously to a singer and then to you as the audience. If you find close matches between the music and what the words mean and big separations, you can begin almost to psychoanalyze the singer, or you can say to yourself, watch that composer interpret these poems. There's a subtext is what I'm saying. The poem doesn't always say what it means. And sometimes people say yes when they mean no, or no when they mean yes. And the same thing is true of poems. And the music can give the audience that. In that case, I think somebody would say, thank you to the composer. I actually feel that Copland gave me Dickinson. I don't think I ever really understood her until I heard what Copland heard. And then I thought, thank you so much. So thank you for that comment and for giving me the opportunity to add this.
Thanks. Thank you for the addition. That was great.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I was wondering whether you've ever looked very closely at the words of the poet Langston Hughes and the many, many settings of the poetry of Langston Hughes.
I don't know the settings. He's wonderful. Please go ahead.
Because I'm a non-musician, just a music lover, but I think he falls in two of the categories I think that I heard you discussing. One is a number of classical composers have set his words to music. So, let's see, Florence Price is one, Margaret Bonds is another. And then people say of the poetry itself, though, that it has such musicality. And so usually the musicality of his poetry as he writes it is usually considered jazz or jazzy.
Yes.
And then, but I think he is, if not, one of the most frequently set poets, in the English, like not just by American composers, but European as well. And I was just curious if you've ever looked at, the Hughes settings or the Hughes poetry from a musical perspective.
Well, the Hughes poetry is full of music. And so I do know some of the poetry and admire it greatly. I don't know the settings of the poems. And it would be interesting to hear when you have a single poem that has been set by numerous composers. That is a fascinating job. To compare, that's not a job, it's fun, to compare them and see, what did this composer hear? What did that composer hear? Do I myself, when I hear these songs, hear what they heard? Do they help me get into their space? It's a very different matching of words and music than that terrible "I'm always chasing rainbows" from Chopin's Impromptu. I always think of those words as ruining that music. I'm much less likely to think of music as ruining those words because I can take it or leave it. And you've actually given me a homework assignment because I will look at those settings. I would love to see how that is set, or his poetry is set. It will be fun. So
yeah, we'll start with Florence Price and Margaret Bonds, and but there are countless others.
I don't know Margaret Bonds' music. I know Florence Price. She's wonderful.
Well, she's getting attention now.
I know she is. It's terrific. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much for hanging in there with me. Any other questions?
I just have a comment. I've probably experienced directly a lot of the things you're talking about by being a pit musician for opera, which we did a lot in symphony. And I've actually played a lot more operas than I've seen. And sometimes we're not playing so much, we can kind of get an idea of what's going on. And other times it's just pure music. And I have an opera reviewer pen pal now who got me to Santa Fe 4 summers. And I've seen some operas now that I've played. And occasionally I'm surprised at what the text is to the music. And sometimes it almost diminishes it to me. There was more depth in playing and just experience it as pure music. Of course, obviously, operas are very much written to illustrate text, but it's a very different experience playing only the music and hearing it purely as music and then seeing the story with it. The other thing is, and I may be a little far afield for our group, but my brother has a folk music singer friend who to me is head and shoulders better than any other folk singer, in that I call him the Schubert of folk singers. His music is incredibly illustrative of the text. Every song reflects different styles of popular music, but he'll do the thing like illustrate literally a single word in the music he writes. And it may be because he was an English teacher for a while. He taught Shakespeare to high school students. And you really see that in the way he composes. One time I went to a round, one of those tables with 3 folk singers. The other 2 folk singers seemed to take the same music and put different words to it. His songs were vastly different from each other and highly illustrative of the text.
That sounds wonderful. That's word painting. When you take a specific word, and it's just so wonderful to hear. I was thinking of your experience sitting in the pit and then seeing the operas. It may be that the words diminished for you because it was just libretto and not particularly good words. On the other hand, Mendelssohn has been quoted to have said that people say that music isn't as specific as words. And he disagrees entirely, that he feels that music is so much more specific and he can say things in music he could never say in words. I think it all depends where your talents lie and your sensibility.
Yeah, that
Can I
makes
ask a
sense.
question? I'd love to know about the poem in Frauenleben und Leben. How do you suggest a 21st century woman identify with Ich will ihm dienen, im Leben, I'll serve him, I will live for him? What do you do?
Okay, I actually wrote a long article about this.
I figured.
So I'll give you a short answer. One way of thinking about it, with just looking at the words, is that men and women spoke to each other that way at that time, and that you can look at Robert's and Clara's letters. I did, and they're both saying the same thing to each other. I'll love you, I'll serve you, you're so noble, I'm so weak. So that's one thing that you can do. And we still talk that way to each other in popular song. I mean, if you think about it, in popular ballads, never mind rap and all, we still talk that way metaphorically. Now, I think that in Frauenleben und Leben, there is the singer who is well, she means what she says. Let's just take it out. She means what he says. I will be your slave. This is what I want. How could you love me? And so forth. And then there's the pianist underneath, and the piano represents Robert. Now think of this. Robert is engaged to Clara when he writes this song cycle, and he gives it to her as a present. Is Robert really saying to one of the century's greatest pianists, I'm sort of suggesting to you that when we get married, you should live for me, you should worship me, I'm noble to you? Or is he saying to her, as I think the music does, I am so concerned that I cannot live up to your expectations of me. I will never be as grand as you take me to be. And you can see this in the music. I can't go into this kind of detail now, but when she has the baby late in the cycle, you can watch in the words that she regards that baby as more important than the husband. And when she says at the end, you have died to me. Now you have hurt me for the first time, and you have died for me. He may not have died. He may have simply hurt her. And so he has died in her estimation of him. Think of the very end. We have a coda at the very end in which the piano plays almost exactly the first song, the accompaniment to the first song. I think that coda is Robert mourning that he can't get her to sing to him again. She won't. He can remember what she sang, but she won't sing it to him again. So I think what I'm saying to you is you can save the song cycle for a contemporary singer by saying, don't take the words at face value only. You must take them at face value, but not only. There's a subtext there, and it's a subtext in which Robert is expressing fear that he cannot live up to her expectations. And if you think of it, that's how it ended when he threw himself into the Rhine, saying on his deathbed in the insane asylum. Last words she said, "Ah, Clara, I am not worthy of your love." I think that's what he was saying in Frauenleben und Leben. There are people who outright reject that argument. And I know some singers who say, it makes it possible for me to sing the cycle. So it just depends. I believe my argument.
Elissa, your talk was just wonderful. Thank you so much. What I wanted to say, when I think of music, I like to think of the words of Tolstoy, where he says music is the language of emotion. And I find that with music, in the time it takes somebody to say a sentence about how they feel, inside of your mind, you can be doubting yourself. You can be thinking, oh, this is really good. Your mind can be wandering. And I think that music can catch all these different things that happen just in the blink of an eye. And anyway, leading up to Ondine, which we'll hear in just a minute, I like to think of Ondine, that water sprite, luring the sailors to their watery deaths. You get to hear their cry, alluring cry, come, come, and then they sink. The next piece I'm going to play on Sharon's beautiful Steinway, that's a 9-footer, by the way, is the Fruehlingsnacht, the Spring Night by Robert Schumann, that was arranged by Franz Liszt. And I just want to point out that Robert Schumann wrote over 200 songs for Clara the first year that they were married. Tony is our member from Delaware, from Wilmington, Delaware, and I asked him to play on the organ on the porch in his home. Tony represents the time when organists and pianists weren't necessarily defined as such. They were called keyboardists, and so Tony has several fabulous instruments in his house, and we're going to hear him play on his porch. And this will be looking ahead to our next meeting, which is in a couple of weeks, on November 2nd, I believe. And that's Rob Landis, who is a local organist with the Methodist Church here. He is going to show us an organ that can be made from a kit, from basically a suitcase. And it's called Orgel Kids, and he takes it around to the schools in Houston and builds an organ. But he's going to show us that, and he's going to have the big church organ there. So right now, through Tony Thurman, who has played on the biggest organs in the world, is going to be playing for us from his porch. So here is Tony.
Thank you, Gayle, for the beautiful introduction, and welcome to Greenville, Delaware, in the northwestern corner of Wilmington. I'm seated in what we call the organ studio here at home. This is an enclosed porch on the back of the house, and the other instruments Gayle mentioned include behind me a two-manual modern digital church organ. We also have a 19th century reed organ and two grand pianos, one by Yamaha and one by August Förster. So instruments are spread out in 3 different rooms in the house so that we have a variety of places to make music here. So thank you for the introduction. So in the early part of the 20th century, the organ was a very popular instrument for playing orchestral transcriptions. And so this was a demonstration of one such transcription, this one being from the opera world for the organ, which is more or less like a one-person orchestra. Every stop knob on the organ behind me is a different instrument in the orchestra. And so the organists in the early part of the 20th century loved playing, these transcriptions, and oftentimes played more transcriptions than actual organ repertoire. So this was an arrangement that my husband Ted wrote for me to play in a recital, a pre-COVID recital at Longwood Gardens at the famous DuPont estate in southeastern Pennsylvania. I told him, how can I go play at Longwood Gardens in the fall and not play an arrangement of the last rose of summer? So so he wrote one for me, and that's what you heard today.
Just wanted to say thank you, Tony. It was beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks.
So what I'd like to do now is ask Suzanne to end the meeting.
I'm so inspired, and I'm headed straight for my music cabinet when this is all over to get out my copy of Fruehlingsnacht and also the cycle of Kofund, with both of which I have performed. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk, Elissa. It was so much food for thought. Thank you so much. And Gayle, oh my goodness, that was wonderful. And Tony, we appreciated all your work so much today, and thank you very, very much. Now, well, I'll look forward now to hearing Rob Landis. That was a great segue from your organ playing into Rob's performance in 2 weeks.